Marcus nodded, making a decision. Ms. Washington, I'd like to propose something. I'm not ready to provide a formal statement about yesterday's specific incident, as we're still conducting our own internal review. However, I would be willing to speak on the record about our vision for Westfield Heights, which includes addressing any systematic inequities that may have existed under previous management. Aisha considered this, tapping her pen thoughtfully against her notebook. And if I were to request an interview in a few weeks, after you've completed your internal review? I believe we would have a more substantive conversation at that time, Marcus replied, the implicit promise clear. All right, Aisha agreed, shifting in her chair as she turned to a fresh page. Let's talk about your vision for Westfield Heights. What specifically do you plan to change? For the next 30 minutes, Marcus and Sophia outlined their plans. Technological upgrades using next-gen solutions, smart building platform, energy efficiency improvements, community spaces redesigned for greater accessibility, and a new resident council with diverse representation to advise on building policies. As the interview concluded and Aisha gathered her belongings, she asked one final question. The residents I spoke with mentioned that you're temporarily staying in Unit 501 while renovating the penthouse. Is that correct? Marcus nodded. Yes. I wanted to experience the building as a resident before making major changes. So the new owner of one of Boston's most exclusive addresses chose to live in the building rather than merely profit from it, Aisha noted, the journalist in her recognizing the narrative potential. That's not the typical approach for investment properties in this market. Westfield Heights isn't a typical investment for us, Marcus replied, walking her to the door. It's a community with history and potential. We intend to honor both. After Aisha departed, Sophia closed the conference room door and leaned against it with a slight smile. She's going to write that story whether we cooperate or not. I know, Marcus acknowledged. Better to help shape it than be blindsided. Speaking of which, he checked his watch. We have a meeting with the maintenance staff in 15 minutes, followed by the security team at 11. I spoke with Richard. And, Sophia prompted. He's coming in tomorrow to discuss the terms of his departure, Marcus replied, gathering the files they'd been reviewing. Though I suspect he'll spend the intervening time attempting to cover his tracks, which is why I've arranged for IT to secure all digital records today. Sophia nodded, her expression somber despite their apparent advantage. You know this won't end with Richard's termination. Wellington will feel implicated, even if only by association. There could be legal pushback. I'm counting on it, Marcus said, surprising her. This was never just about buying a building or removing one problematic manager. It's about exposing a system that allows discrimination to persist behind a veneer of respectability and tradition. If Wellington wants to fight, they'll only bring more attention to practices they'd rather keep hidden. Sophia studied her business partner and friend, recognizing the resolve that had fueled his journey from rejected applicant to building owner. Just be prepared. When you challenge established powers, the resistance is rarely straightforward. This could get complicated. It already is, Marcus replied, thinking of the residents whose experiences had been documented in the files before them, people who had faced subtle barriers and indignities in what should have been the sanctuary of their own homes. But complicated doesn't mean impossible. The next week unfolded with the inexorable momentum of long-suppressed truth finally emerging into the light. Richard Whitman, after a tense meeting in which he fluctuated between defensive justification and grudging acknowledgement of possible oversights, accepted a termination agreement that included a non-disclosure clause and waived severance in exchange for Marcus not pursuing legal action for documented violations of fair housing regulations. What Richard hadn't anticipated, what none of them had fully foreseen, was how quickly the story would spread throughout Boston's property management circles. The Boston Globe's front-page article, titled "Discrimination Comes Full Circle, New Owner Exposes Systemic Bias in Luxury Housing," presented Marcus Johnson not as a disruptive outsider, but as a necessary corrective to entrenched inequities. The article detailed how Marcus, once rejected as an applicant at Westfield Heights during his Harvard years, had returned 15 years later as owner, only to personally experience the same discriminatory practices that had previously excluded him and others. Aisha Washington had masterfully woven together the immediate incident with broader patterns of housing discrimination in Boston's luxury market, creating a narrative that resonated far beyond the building's prestigious address. Former Westfield Heights residents came forward with their own stories after reading the article. 3 of them, with the assistance of the Civil Rights Division of Pearson and Hardman Law, filed formal discrimination complaints against both Richard Whitman and Wellington Property Group for violations of fair housing laws dating back several years. Most damaging of all, Richard's recorded confrontation with Marcus somehow appeared online, posted anonymously to a housing advocacy group's website. The video, showing Richard's immediate assumption of wrongdoing and his coded language when calling the police, became a case study in unconscious bias training sessions across the city. For Richard Whitman, the consequences extended beyond professional embarrassment. Former colleagues distanced themselves, invitations to industry events quietly disappeared, and his previously sterling reputation within Boston's property management community collapsed with remarkable speed. Each time he applied for a new position, a simple internet search now revealed his most inglorious professional moment, preserved forever in digital amber. By the end of the second week, Wellington Property Group issued a carefully worded statement disavowing Richard's actions and emphasizing their commitment to fair housing practices, a public relations effort that implicitly acknowledged the validity of the complaints while attempting to contain the damage to their broader portfolio of properties. Marcus watched these developments from the temporary office in Westfield Heights, neither gloating nor intervening as the consequences of long-entrenched discrimination finally materialized in public view. There was no satisfaction in witnessing Richard's downfall, only a sober recognition that one individual's removal, while necessary, represented merely the beginning of a much larger transformation. As Sophia had predicted, the situation grew increasingly complicated. Wellington's attorneys sent formal communication questioning whether Marcus had disclosed his prior rejection as an applicant during acquisition negotiations, suggesting potential legal action for material omissions during the purchase process. Marcus had anticipated this move and directed his legal team at Pearson and Hardman to respond with evidence of Wellington's documented pattern of fair housing violations across multiple properties, information gathered during due diligence but not previously disclosed. The implied threat was clear. Pursuing legal action against Marcus would only expose Wellington to greater scrutiny and potential liability. The back and forth continued for several days before Wellington abruptly withdrew their objections, signaling a reluctant acceptance that further conflict would only compound their vulnerability. Throughout this corporate chess match, Marcus maintained his focus on the building itself and its residents. The promised community meeting took place in the renovated lobby, with nearly 80% of residents attending, a remarkable turnout that reflected both curiosity about the new ownership and genuine concern about the building's future. Marcus and Sophia presented their vision with transparency, acknowledging the discriminatory practices that had occurred while emphasizing their commitment to creating an inclusive community that maintained the building's historic character and luxury amenities. They introduced the concept of a resident council with representatives from each floor, outlined the technological upgrades planned for the coming months, and assured longtime residents that any rent adjustments would be gradual and predictable. Mrs. Cavendish, still cradling Pebbles despite the dog's apparent indifference to proceedings, served as an unofficial barometer of resident sentiment. Her initial skepticism gradually softened as Marcus addressed concerns about construction disruption and preservation of the building's architectural details. By the meeting's conclusion, her approving nod as she departed signaled a tentative acceptance that rippled through the remaining residents. In the days that followed, Marcus personally visited each resident who had documented complaints under the previous management, listening to their experiences and outlining specific steps being taken to address their concerns. These conversations, conducted without publicity or witnesses, formed the foundation of trust that statistics and promises alone could not establish. 3 weeks after the initial confrontation on the sidewalk, Marcus sat alone in Unit 501, surrounded by partially unpacked boxes and the wooden crate containing his Harvard diploma and family photographs. The evening light streamed through windows that framed a view of Commonwealth Avenue's tree-lined median, the historic brownstones beyond, and the Charles River glinting in the distance, a quintessential Boston panorama that had once seemed permanently beyond his reach. His phone chimed with a text from Sophia. Just confirmed Pearson and Hardman is filing the class action tomorrow. Ready for the next phase? Marcus gazed at the framed photograph of his parents, his father in a postal worker's uniform, his mother wearing the practical attire of an elementary school teacher, both beaming with pride at his Harvard graduation. Neither had lived to see him purchase the building that had once rejected their son, but he felt their presence in this moment of transition. Ready, he texted back, knowing that the true work of transformation was only beginning. The consequences that had fallen upon Richard Whitman and rippled through Wellington Property Group represented merely the clearing of ground for what would follow, the challenging, gradual, essential work of building a community where belonging wasn't determined by appearance or assumptions, but by the simple human right to call a place home. As twilight settled over Boston, Marcus finally hung his Harvard diploma on the wall of Unit 501, not as a defensive assertion of credentials, but as a reminder of the journey that had brought him to this moment. The paper bore the Latin phrase veritas, truth, an appropriate sentiment for a time when long-hidden realities were finally emerging into the light, with all the pain and possibility that such revelation inevitably brings. 6 months after, the confrontation on the sidewalk of Commonwealth Avenue, Westfield Heights, had undergone a metamorphosis that extended far beyond its physical structure. The building still maintained its classic Boston Brahmin exterior, the ornate cornices and distinguished brick facade preserved with historical accuracy, but behind the traditional envelope, a revolution had quietly taken place. The lobby, once a testament to faded grandeur with its worn Persian rugs and outdated furnishings, had been transformed into a space that honored the past while embracing the future. The original marble floors had been meticulously restored to their early 20th century luster, while the reception desk now featured an elegant touchscreen directory integrated seamlessly into the refinished mahogany. The previous dim lighting had been replaced with energy-efficient fixtures that mimicked natural daylight, illuminating previously shadowed corners and architectural details that had gone unnoticed for decades. Marcus stood in this transformed space early on a crisp February morning, watching as residents moved through their daily routines. Mrs. Cavendish, her ever-present Yorkie now sporting a plaid sweater against the winter chill, paused to tap the touchscreen with surprising dexterity for someone who had initially protested the technological upgrades as unnecessary modernization. She glanced up, caught Marcus's eye, and offered a small but genuine smile before continuing on her way. These small acknowledgments from long-time residents had become increasingly common as the promised improvements materialized without disrupting the building's essential character. The careful balance Marcus and Sophia had struck, honoring tradition while correcting its exclusionary aspects, had gradually won over even the most skeptical tenants. The contractor confirmed they'll finish. "The penthouse renovations by the end of next week," Sophia reported, joining Marcus in the lobby. 6 months of overseeing the building's transformation had done nothing to diminish her immaculate professional presentation, though she had adapted her wardrobe to include more comfortable footwear after countless hours navigating construction, zones, and mechanical rooms. Right on schedule, remarkably enough. "Any issues with the sustainable heating system?" Marcus asked, his attention to detail undiminished, despite juggling the building renovations with his ongoing responsibilities at Next Gen Solutions. "None so far. The engineers say the efficiency metrics are exceeding projections." Sophia checked her tablet, scrolling through the latest reports. "And the new maintenance request system has reduced response time to an average of 18 hours across all residents, with no statistically significant variations based on demographic factors." This last point was delivered with particular satisfaction. The standardized maintenance request process, with its transparent tracking system and accountability measures, had been one of their first implementations, directly addressing the disparate treatment documented under Richard Whitman's management. "Excellent," Marcus nodded, glancing at his watch. "The resident council meets at 10. I'd like to review the quarterly satisfaction survey results before then." They made their way to the former conference room, now redesigned as a multi-purpose community space. The darkwood paneling had been preserved but lightened with a careful restoration process, while the windows had been expanded to bring in more natural light. Modular furniture could be reconfigured for meetings, social gatherings, or the weekly yoga classes that had proven unexpectedly popular with residents across all age groups. The resident council had been Marcus's most transformative innovation. Initially met with skepticism, particularly from longer-term tenants accustomed to top-down management decisions, the council had evolved into a genuinely representative body that provided meaningful input on building operations. The 7 members, elected by floor rather than by seniority or ownership status, included voices that would have gone unheard under the previous regime. Dr. Aisha Washington, whose reporting for the Boston Globe had helped catalyze the changes at Westfield Heights, had been elected as the council's inaugural chair, a position she balanced with her journalistic career and her newly launched book project chronicling housing discrimination in Boston's luxury market. As Marcus and Sophia settled in to review the survey data, a notification appeared on Marcus's tablet. An email from Elaine Chen at Pearson & Hardman regarding the class action settlement with Wellington Property Group. The legal proceedings had concluded more quickly than anticipated, with Wellington agreeing to a substantial settlement rather than risking the public exposure of a trial. The agreement included monetary compensation for former residents who had experienced discrimination, funding for fair housing initiatives throughout Boston, and mandatory bias training for property management staff across Wellington's entire portfolio. "They've scheduled the final settlement announcement for next Tuesday," Marcus informed Sophia after reviewing the email. "Elaine says the judge was particularly impressed by the comprehensive documentation we provided. 6 months of legal wrangling, condensed into a 15-minute court appearance," Sophia observed. "Sometimes justice is remarkably anticlimactic. The outcome matters more than the spectacle," Marcus replied, though he understood her point. The methodical accumulation of evidence, the careful navigation of legal channels, and the strategic application of pressure had proven effective, but lacked the emotional catharsis of more confrontational approaches. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the resident council members, filing in for their scheduled meeting. Dr. Washington led the group, followed by Mrs. Cavendish, whose initial resistance to the council had transformed into enthusiastic participation once she realized her concerns about preserving the building's historic character would be genuinely respected. The remaining members represented the building's diverse population. Chen Wei, a graduate student at MIT who had moved in after the ownership change. James Forrester, a retired history professor who had lived in the building for nearly 20 years. Maria Gonzalez, a surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital. David Kelly, a work-from-home software engineer. And Robert Williams, a black financial advisor who had previously been rejected as an applicant under Richard's management but had recently moved into a vacant unit on the 4th floor. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus greeted them, transitioning smoothly from owner to facilitator as the council settled around the table. "Thank you for making time for today's meeting. We have several items on the agenda, but I'd like to start with the results of the resident satisfaction survey." The meeting proceeded with the productive efficiency that had become its hallmark. Issues were raised, discussed with candor, and addressed with practical solutions. The survey results revealed a 78% overall satisfaction rate, a dramatic improvement from the 42% baseline established in their initial assessment, with particularly strong gains in maintenance responsiveness and communication transparency. "There's still room for improvement in the visitor registration system," Dr. Washington noted, highlighting a recurring concern. "Some guests report feeling unnecessarily scrutinized, particularly visitors of color." Marcus nodded, taking the aide critique seriously. We've implemented standardized protocols for all visitors, but perception matters as much as policy. Perhaps we should conduct additional training for front desk staff, with input from residents who've experienced these issues. The discussion continued, addressing concerns about the upcoming lobby renovation phase, scheduling of community events, and proposals for expanding sustainable initiatives throughout the building. Throughout, Marcus maintained the delicate balance he had cultivated, respecting the council's autonomy while providing the necessary resources and authority to implement their recommendations. As the meeting concluded and the council members dispersed, Dr. Washington remained behind, organizing her notes with the methodical precision that characterized both her journalistic and leadership approaches. The settlement announcement next week will likely generate renewed media interest in Westfield Heights, she observed, her reporter's instincts ever present despite her dual role as resident and council chair. How do you plan to respond? Marcus considered this, appreciating her directness. With transparency but restraint. The legal resolution is important, but I'm more interested in focusing on the positive changes we've implemented and the community we're building. Aisha nodded, her expression thoughtful. You know, when I first moved in here 2 years ago, I kept a detailed log of every interaction with management, every maintenance request, every subtle slight, documentation for a potential discrimination. Claim I never filed. It became second nature, that constant vigilance. She closed her notebook with a decisive motion. I realized last week that I've stopped keeping the log. Sometime in the past few months it simply wasn't necessary anymore. The simple statement carried more weight than elaborate praise might have. Marcus acknowledged it with a nod, recognizing the profound shift it represented. From the hyper-awareness required to navigate biased systems to the freedom of existing, in a space where such vigilance was no longer required. After Dr. Washington departed, Marcus made his way up to Unit 501, which he continued to occupy despite the penthouse renovations nearing completion. The apartment had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where he could reflect on the ongoing transformation of Westfield Heights and his own evolving relationship with the building that had once rejected him. The afternoon light streamed through, windows that framed views of Boston's winter landscape, the Charles River partially frozen, its surface a mosaic of ice and dark water. Marcus settled at his desk, reviewing architectural plans for the building's next phase of improvements, when an unexpected notification appeared on his phone, a LinkedIn message from Richard Whitman. The sight of the name caused a momentary pause, a brief return to that Sunday afternoon confrontation that now seemed to belong to a different lifetime. In the 6 months since Richard's termination, Marcus had heard occasional updates through industry contacts. After being effectively blacklisted from property management positions throughout Boston, Richard had reportedly moved to his sister's home in Worcester, his professional identity as shattered as his personal reputation. Marcus opened the message with measured curiosity. Mr. Johnson, I hope this message finds you well. After considerable reflection on the events at Westfield Heights and their aftermath, I'm writing to request a meeting. I believe there are things that need to be said in person, rather than through digital correspondence. I understand if you decline, but I ask that you consider it. Respectfully, Richard Whitman. The message's careful formality revealed little about its purpose, whether it represented a genuine attempt at reconciliation or merely a strategic effort to rehabilitate a damaged reputation. Marcus sat with the request, neither immediately accepting nor dismissing it, allowing himself to consider the various possibilities such a meeting might present. His contemplation was interrupted by a call from Sophia, who had remained at the high community space to address follow-up items from the council meeting. You might want to come down to the lobby, she said without preamble. There's someone here you should meet. The tone of her voice, a mixture of surprise and something approaching amusement, piqued Marcus's curiosity. Who is it? Better to see for yourself, Sophia replied cryptically. 3rd floor elevator lobby. Intrigued, Marcus made his way back to the elevator and descended to the third floor, where the corridor opening to Dr. Washington's Unit 3B, among others. As he stepped out, he immediately spotted Sophia standing with a man whose back was turned, a tall, slender figure with graying hair wearing a worn but clean winter coat. As Marcus approached, the man turned, and recognition was immediate. Richard Whitman, noticeably thinner than when they had last encountered each other, his previously self-important bearing replaced by a hesitancy that seemed foreign to his physical presence. "Mr. Johnson," Richard acknowledged, his voice lacking its former authoritative tone. "I apologize for appearing unannounced. I sent a message, but then decided." He trailed off, seemingly uncertain how to explain his presence. "Mr. Whitman," Marcus responded neutrally, glancing at Sophia, whose expression communicated that she had the situation under control. "This is unexpected. I was just explaining to Mr. Whitman that we have a standard visitor policy," Sophia said, a subtle reminder of the protocols that had replaced the discriminatory practices of the past. "All guests need to be registered at the front desk." The irony of Richard being subject to the standardized procedures that had replaced his selective enforcement wasn't lost on any of them. A fleeting expression crossed Richard's face. Recognition, perhaps, of how the roles had reversed. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private," Marcus suggested, noting the potential for residents to emerge from their units at any moment. "The community room should be available now." Richard nodded, following Marcus and Sophia in silence as they returned to the elevator and made their way to the renovated space. The transformation since Richard had last seen it was stark, from the dark, outdated conference room to the bright, welcoming environment it had become. Once inside with the door closed, Richard took in the changes with visible surprise. "You've done remarkable work with the building," he said finally, the first unprompted observation he had offered. "Thank you," Marcus replied, gesturing for Richard to take a seat while he and Sophia remained standing, a subtle maintenance of the power dynamic that had shifted so dramatically since their first encounter. "What brings you here today, Mr. Whitman?" Richard sat carefully, his posture revealing none of the entitled confidence that had once characterized his presence in the building. "I've had 6 months to reflect on my actions, not just on that Sunday with you, but throughout my 15 years at Westfield Heights." He paused, seeming to carefully consider his next words. "I've been required to attend fair housing workshops as part of the settlement. 6 workshops and 100 hours of community service." "And what have you learned?" Marcus asked, echoing the question raised in their last conversation months earlier, his tone neither accusatory nor sympathetic. Richard was quiet for a moment, his gaze directed at his hands resting on the table before him. "That I was part of a system I didn't even see. Or maybe I did see it, but I benefited from it, so I didn't question it." He looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes directly for perhaps the first time without defensiveness or suspicion. "The patterns that seemed so obvious in the documentation you gathered, the differential treatment, the selective enforcement, I had convinced myself were just efficient management, focusing resources where they would be most appreciated." The euphemism hung in the air, its inadequacy apparent to all present. "Appreciated by whom?" Sophia asked, her tone making it clear that the question was not merely rhetorical. "By residents who matched the building's traditional profile," Richard admitted, the careful phrasing itself revealing how deeply ingrained the patterns of discrimination remained, even as he attempted to acknowledge them. "By people who looked like the residents, who had always lived here, who looked like me." Marcus observed Richard carefully, noting the complex mixture of genuine realization and lingering blind spots that characterized his halting explanation. "Understanding the problem is only the beginning," he noted. "Why are you here today specifically?" Richard straightened slightly, as though gathering resolve for what he had come to say. "I've lost everything that defined me professionally. My reputation, my career, my standing in the community, all gone, and deservedly so. The admission seemed to cost him effort, but was delivered without self-pity. What I didn't expect to lose was my understanding of myself, who I thought I was versus who my actions revealed me to be. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded brochure, placing it carefully on the table. The glossy pamphlet bore the logo of the Boston Fair Housing Coalition, one of the organizations funded by the Wellington Settlement. They're establishing a new initiative training property managers in equitable practices, Richard explained, using real scenarios to help managers recognize and correct biased behaviors before they become systemic patterns. He hesitated, then continued with visible effort. They've asked me to consider participating, not as an expert, but as a case study, using my experience, including our recorded interaction, to help others recognize what I failed to see in myself.